The desert sun was already sinking when the order came down like a death sentence. A thin British supply convoy, 20-odd soft-skinned trucks, and a handful of flimsy escorts would have to drive straight into a German advance to reach a trapped battalion before nightfall. The map said it was madness. Recon reports spoke of panzers, anti-tank guns, and roaming scout cars hunting anything on wheels. But in one of those dust-covered cabs, hands gripping a worn steering wheel, sat a quiet driver named Thomas Hale, a man whose name would never make the headlines, but whose idea, born in fear and desperation, would turn this fragile column of fuel and ammunition into something no one expected. An improvised armored spearhead that punched straight into the German line and tore open a path to survival. Thomas Hale had never looked like a hero. He was not a decorated officer or a famous tank commander. He was a driver, a man who knew every rattle and cough of his Bedford lorry, who could coax life from an engine that was more whole than metal. He had joined the army not with dreams of glory, but because the farm at home could not feed them all, and the pay, small as it was, might keep his younger sister in school and his parents from losing the land. In North Africa, his war was grease on his hands, dust in his teeth, and the steady grind of gears as he hauled fuel, shells, water, and hope through a landscape that seemed determined to swallow machines whole. He had seen convoys hit before, the sudden shriek of Stuka dive bombers, the ripping thud of machine gun fire, trucks erupting into fireballs as men tumbled from cabs, burning and screaming. He knew what unarmored meant in a world of steel and shrapnel. And he knew as the officer read out the orders that if they went forward like this, thin-skinned, lined up like targets, they would be slaughtered long before they reached the men who were waiting for those supplies to live through the night. The briefing was quick, cold, and bitter. German armored units had slipped around the flank and were driving hard toward a British brigade dug in around a rocky ridge 30 miles ahead. Radio contact said they were running low on everything. Ammunition almost spent, fuel tanks near dry, medical stores down to rags and morphine residue. If the convoy did not reach them before the Germans cut the last track, that brigade, already battered, would be trapped and crushed. Command had few choices. The tanks that could have formed a proper spearhead were committed elsewhere. The remaining units were scattered, refitting, or pinned. So someone in a quiet tent with a pencil and a map drew a line where no sane driver would willingly go and pointed at the supply convoy. That arrow passed through open ground, marked by only a few wadi lines and vague reports of enemy patrols. A colonel called it a necessary risk. To Hale, listening at the back of the tent, it felt like being told to steer his truck into the barrel of a gun and hope the bullet missed. Outside, the men stood by their lorries, some smoking, some silent, each lost in his own tight circle of fear. The vehicles themselves were a patchwork of the British war effort. Bedfords and Morris trucks, some with canvas sides patched with whatever fabric they could find, some with doors that did not close properly, some running on tires that should have been retired weeks ago. Ammunition boxes were stacked high, tied down with rope. Fuel barrels lay in the truck beds, sweating fumes under the heat, next to crates of water and ration tins. A couple of light armored cars, their thin plating already pockmarked by previous encounters, idled at the front and rear of the column, serving as the only real armor in what was supposed to pass for a lifeline. The desert wind pushed dust across the camp, scratching at eyes and throats, settling on everything like ash. And in that dust, Hale stood by his lorry, feeling a tightness in his chest, listening to the cough of engines starting up, and thinking about the last time he had driven past burning trucks and the men who never climbed out. On the surface, Thomas was calm. Drivers were expected to be steady. Panic at the wheel killed as surely as bullets. But inside, his mind was racing, not with memories of home this time, but with the brutal logic of survival. He thought about how German gunners picked off soft targets first, about how the sight of fuel trucks must look like a gift to enemy armor. He remembered the stories told over mess tins of how some drivers in earlier campaigns lashed sandbags to the sides of cabs, how others tried to shelter behind tanks that were not there anymore. He also thought about the loads they carried now, heavy crates of shells, metal jerry cans, spare track links, rolled up steel plating for field repairs. To most, it was just cargo. To him, suddenly, it looked like raw material. He looked down the line of trucks and saw not just vulnerability, but potential. The realization came as a flicker of something wild and dangerous. What if they did not go forward as a naked line of targets? What if the convoy could be reshaped, turned from a string of prey into a point of impact? It sounded insane even inside his own head. He was not an officer. He was not an engineer. Every instinct drilled into him told him to shut up, keep his place, and obey. But another voice, the one that had watched men die for lack of someone doing something different, would not stay quiet. He imagined trucks side by side, not nose to tail, reinforcing their most vulnerable spots, using their own cargo to shield themselves. He pictured fuel drums piled and strapped to absorb shrapnel, crates of shells acting as rough armor, spare steel plating bolted and chained to cab doors and engine grills. It would not make them tanks, but it might make them something else. A blunt, ugly spear, pushed by desperation and driven by men who had nothing left to lose. He hesitated only a moment, then walked toward the nearest officer, a harried captain flanked by maps and a shouting sergeant. Hale's voice was steady but urgent as he explained his idea. Reorganize the convoy, bring the heaviest trucks forward, lash on whatever improvised armor they could, concentrate the few armored cars at the very tip, and turn the whole formation into a wedge instead of a line. Use dust and smoke, he said, to hide their approach. Burn spare fuel in drums at the flanks, created a rolling curtain. The captain stared at him as if wondering whether this driver had gone mad under the sun. Around them, other men paused, listening, faces lined with sweat and disbelief. Time was short, orders were written. This was not how things were done. And yet, beneath the surprise and irritation, another thought crept into the captain's mind. They were out of options. What Hale proposed was dangerous, improvised, and completely against textbook doctrine. But textbook doctrine had not been written for days like this. For a long second that felt like an hour, the war hung on a silence between rank and courage. Hale could feel his heart hammering. He had stepped out of line in every sense, and if his idea was rejected, he would go back to his lorry knowing he had tried and failed, and maybe die with that regret burning in his chest. But the captain was not blind to reality. He too had seen convoys wiped out. He knew the odds. At last he nodded once, sharp and decisive, and called for the sergeant. "We're doing it his way," he said. The words rippled through the line like a shock. Men turned to look at the quiet driver who had just changed their fate. Some muttered, some shook their heads. Others felt a small, unexpected spark of hope. In the dry, hot air of the desert, under a sky already beginning to redden, Thomas Hale's mad idea moved from thought to plan, and the ordinary supply convoy began, piece by piece, to turn into something it had never been meant to be. They started with ropes, curses, and bare hands. The column ground to a halt as drivers, fitters, and anyone with a pocket knife or wrench swarmed over the trucks. The neat order of a British convoy dissolved into what looked, at first glance, like chaos. Men clambered onto flatbeds, heaving crates of shells against the sides of the booms, stacking them in crude walls shoulder high. Others rolled heavy fuel drums into place, securing them with chains and whatever straps they could find, turning volatile cargo into sacrificial shields. Old spare track links and discarded armor plates, meant for tank repairs, were dragged from the backs of vehicles and hoisted up against thin metal skins, bolted through with long screws driven by bleeding hands. Canvas covers were ripped and tied over the makeshift plating to break up their shape. It was ugly, improvised, and so far from regulation that it bordered on lunacy. Yet as each piece was lashed into place, the trucks began to look less like mere targets and more like armored beasts, crude and defiant, ready to force their way through fire. Hale moved among them not as an officer, but as a man possessed by a sense of responsibility he had never asked for. He showed one driver how to angle fuel drums so that they overlapped, forming a rough curve to deflect some of the blast. He pointed out weak spots, exposed radiators, bare doors, and ordered spare steel and sandbags thrown against them. He suggested that the lighter trucks with food and medical supplies stay behind the core wedge, protected by the armored mass in front. His hands shook as he worked, not from fear of the enemy they had not yet seen, but from the knowledge that if his mad design failed, these men would die because they trusted him. He had always believed that command was for others. Now, with sweat stinging his eyes and the thunder of hammers all around, he realized that leadership sometimes arrived disguised as necessity, and you did not get to refuse it. The officers, too, were transforming. The captain who had accepted Hale's idea was now barking orders that sounded half official, half inspired. Reorganize the column into 3 layers, put the most heavily armored trucks in a tight spearhead, position the scarce armored cars not spread out, but at the very front of the point and along its flanks, like metal teeth guarding a vulnerable throat. Gunners climbed onto truck beds, setting up light machine guns on makeshift mounts made from crates and broken frames. Someone suggested welding, but there was no time and no safe power source, so they relied on brute force and the sheer weight of material. The sergeant, a man used to mocking anything that smelled like invention, stalked through the dust, shouting at men to tie knots tighter, to stop complaining, and to remember that the Germans would not give them a second chance to get this right. In his gruff barks, though, there was something new, a grim respect for the driver whose idea now defined all of their chances. As the sun bled lower toward the horizon, the convoy's shape changed. No longer a stretched-out snake of vehicles, it contracted into a dense, ugly arrowhead. At the very tip rolled the armored cars, thinly plated but armed, their turrets twitching as if already searching for targets. Directly behind them came Hale's wedge, 3 of the heaviest trucks, their fronts matted with spare track, steel, and sandbags, their sides layered with stacked crates and fuel drums strapped so tightly that the wood creaked. Hale's own Bedford sat in the center of that trio, its windshield partially shielded by a metal grill that cut his view but might just catch a burst of machine gun fire before it shredded his face. Behind that spearhead clustered the rest of the convoy, trucks packed wheel to wheel, close enough that drivers could almost reach out and touch the next man's cab. It was dangerous. One hit could block them all. But it also meant that the entire mass would move as one, a single, determined thrust instead of a straggling line. Then came the second part of the madness, the smoke. Under Hale's urging, they set aside a few old fuel drums and loaded them onto trailers at the outer edges of the formation. They punched holes in the tops, stuffed in rags, and prepared to light them once they were underway. The idea was simple and terrifying. As they drove, they would drag their own moving wall of thick smoke alongside and behind them, choking the desert air and blinding German gunners waiting to pick them off at range. It would make driving harder, it would make breathing harder, and it could easily turn the entire convoy into a furnace if something went wrong. But it would also turn clear sand and open sky into a shifting fog of shadows. Hale remembered, with painful clarity, the previous raids where German shells had found them in clear daylight. If they were going to be hunted, he thought, let it be in a storm of their own making. As the final cords were tied and last-minute adjustments made, the men had a moment to stare at what they had built. It was not a proper armored column. No manual would recognize it. It looked like a scrapyard on wheels, a column of patched-up beasts made from fear, ingenuity, and whatever metal and cloth they could drag onto the trucks. But the change in the men's faces was unmistakable. Where there had been only resignation, now there was a fierce, stubborn light. Drivers climbed into cabs that no longer felt like coffins, but like fighting positions. Gunners checked belts of ammunition with hands that trembled less than they had an hour before. One young soldier ran his fingers along the edge of a bolted plate and whispered something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a promise to someone waiting at home. Another slapped the side of his truck and grinned without humor, calling it our bloody tank, earning a few dark chuckles. In that moment, the line between myth and reality blurred. They were still vulnerable, still mortal, but they were no longer simply prey. Hale slid into his seat, feeling the altered weight of his vehicle the moment he pressed the clutch. The steering would be heavier, the lorry slower to respond, the engine straining under the load of steel and sandbags. He tested the wheel, listening to the groan of the frame. Every new sound was a reminder of the risk he had created. He caught his reflection for a second in the cracked side mirror, dust-streaked face, hollow eyes, a smear of grease across his cheek, and hardly recognized himself. This was not the farm boy who had left green fields and rain behind. This was a man who had just gambled not only his life, but the lives of dozens of others on an idea no one had ever tested. A wave of doubt slammed into him, sharp and suffocating. What if the extra weight made them too slow? What if the fuel drums exploded at the first hit and turned the Spearhead into a fireball? What if, by trying to save the convoy, he had made their destruction more certain? His hands tightened on the wheel until his knuckles ached. The only answer he found was brutally simple. Doing nothing would have been worse. Engines fired one by one, the convoy coming alive with a ragged roar that rolled across the sand. The captain walked quickly down the line, exchanging brief nods, a few clipped words, a hand on a shoulder here and there. He stopped by Hale's cab for a second, resting one hand on the armored side. "We're committed now," he said quietly, the bluster gone from his voice. "Whatever happens out there, this was the right call." It was not a promise of survival, no one could pretend that. But it was something else, something Hale had not expected. Validation. A recognition that, in a war of orders and ranks, an ordinary driver's idea had become the backbone of their best hope. Hale swallowed, unable to trust his voice, and simply nodded. Outside, the sergeant signaled to the lead armored car. The order rippled through. Forward. The convoy began to crawl, then rumble, then roll with purpose into the open desert. Dust billowed under the wheels as they left the relative safety of their staging area and headed into the wide, exposed landscape where so many columns had died before. Men lit the prepared fuel drums at the flanks, and thick, oily smoke started to pour out, clinging to the ground at first, then rising in swirling columns. It smelled of burning oil, of risk, of desperate ingenuity. As the convoy gained speed, the smoke stretched out, curling around the Spearhead, turning the improvised armored wedge into a ghostly shape half visible through the shifting darkness. Somewhere out there ahead, German guns waited behind low ridges and rocky outcrops, their crews confident that another fragile British convoy would soon be in their sights. What they were about to see instead was something unexpected. A moving wall of smoke hiding a formation that should not have existed, forged not in a factory, but in the mind of a mad driver who refused to accept the quiet death of obedience. The first thing the Germans saw was not a neat British line, but a dark smear crawling across the sand. From their positions dug into the low ridges and rocky folds of the desert, they had been waiting for the familiar shape, thin-skinned lorries strung out in a fragile line, easy to pick off with well-aimed fire. Instead, through the shimmer of heat and dust, a dense patch of smoke appeared, rolling and twisting like a living thing, hiding whatever moved inside it. A junior German gunner lifted his field glasses, frowning, trying to pick out individual vehicles, but the smoke wall broke his view into fragments of shadow and light. He could hear engines, many engines, but could not count them, could not be sure where the head of the column actually was. He muttered something to his commander, who snapped a reply and ordered them to aim into the thickest part, trusting in the weight of metal more than perfect visibility. Behind the ridge, gun crews swung their barrels, calibrating for range and elevation, unaware that their target was no longer a line, but a spear. Inside the smoke, visibility dropped to a ghostly world of shapes and flickers. Hale's world narrowed to what he could see through the slated gap between the armored grille and the filthy windscreen. The sun was reduced to a pale, diffused glow, filtered through the oily black haze streaming over and alongside them. The smell clawed into his throat, a mix of burning fuel, hot metal, and the familiar tang of desert dust. Grit stung his eyes and stuck to the sweat on his face. He could barely make out the outline of the armored car a few truck lengths ahead, its turret just a dark hump in the swirling murk. Somewhere to his left, another truck in the Spearhead rumbled along so close that its wheels occasionally kicked stones into his own. Men coughed in the back, the sounds muffled by the roar of the engine and the clatter of loose metal. He felt every bump, every lurch, as if the road itself were trying to throw them out of formation. But he held the wheel steady, knuckles white, eyes fixed on that ghostly shape in front of him like a lifeline. The first German shells came in as distant, rising screams that cut through the engine noise before slamming into the sand with shuddering thumps. Plumes of dust erupted to one side of the smoke wall, then another as the enemy tried to bracket the unseen column. A shell detonated closer, the shockwave hammering Hale's cab, the sound a brutal crack that rattled his teeth. The truck shuddered but held. Behind him someone yelled, not words, just raw sound, and then fell silent as they clamped down on their fear. Another round hit somewhere at the rear of the convoy. Hale couldn't see it, but he felt the tremor through the ground, heard the faint cries carried forward by the wind. For a split second, his mind flashed to the men in those back vehicles, the ones he couldn't protect with his armored wedge. Guilt surged up, threatening to drag his focus away from the road. But in the same instant, he remembered the maps in the captain's dugout, the long arrows that either reached their destination or ended in crosses. If the Spearhead broke now, none of it would matter. Supplies, fuel, lives, all would be lost. He forced his attention back to the smoke-dimmed world ahead, swallowing the bitter taste of helplessness. As the German gunners adjusted their aim, the shells began to fall closer to the heart of the moving smoke. One exploded just in front of the lead armored car, the flash a brief white bloom in the darkness before the vehicle emerged through the dust, rocking wildly, tires skidding but miraculously intact. Another shell struck the edge of the convoy, catching the outermost armored truck at the flank. The blast tore away a section of its sandbag wall and bent its bolted plates inward like torn paper. The driver inside, a man Hale had shared stale cigarettes with an hour ago, fought the wheel as his vehicle lurched sideways. For one terrifying moment, it seemed the truck would swerve into the Spearhead and block the whole formation. Then, somehow, he corrected, dragging the crippled vehicle back into line, though flames now licked at its side. Through his narrow view, Hale caught a glimpse of the other man's profile, mouth open in a wordless roar, face lit by the flickering fire. They locked eyes for a heartbeat across the chaos, a silent exchange between two men pinned to a decision that could not be undone, and then the smoke swallowed them both again. The improvised armor began to earn its brutal keep. A burst of German machine gun fire, blind through the haze, stitched across the front of Hale's Spearhead. Bullets hammered into the piled crates and sandbags, splintering wood and sending fountains of sand into the cab. A few rounds sparked off the spare track links bolted across the radiator, whining away into the void. One impact hit with a different sound, a crack and dull thud that told Hale a bullet had buried itself somewhere in the makeshift plating inches from his legs. Instead of punching straight through the door, he flinched instinctively, vision flaring white for a second with pure animal fear. In that heartbeat, he understood with terrifying clarity that if he had not insisted on plating the doors, his thigh would now be shredded, his foot off the pedal, his truck skewed across the road. Blocking everyone behind. The thought sent a chill through him, even in the suffocating heat. The added weight that had worried him suddenly felt like a shield he could almost trust. Around the Spearhead, the convoy's plan revealed its true shape. The armored cars in front fired short, controlled bursts into the smoke beyond, not hoping to hit unseen enemies, but to keep German heads down and sow confusion. Their tracers carved brief glowing lines in the murk before vanishing into the haze. On the flanks, gunners atop the trucks scanned for flashes, the telltale muzzle flare of enemy guns on the ridges. Whenever one flared, they would answer with their own fire, a ragged but determined chorus of defiance that cut through the one-sided slaughter that Hale had known too well. The moving fuel drum smoke screen did its grim work, breaking the clean lines of sight that German gunners relied on, forcing them to fire at guesses and silhouettes. It was messy, it was imperfect, and it was far from safe. But compared to the open road ambushes of the past, it was a different world. One in which the British convoy, for the first time, felt like a formation that could force its way through, not merely hope to slip by. Inside Hale, another battle raged, not of shells and bullets, but of voices. One whispered that they were still just men in trucks, pretending to be tanks, that sooner or later German fire would find a seam in their makeshift armor and rip them apart. Another, quieter but growing stronger, insisted that what they were doing mattered beyond this one road, this one day. If they proved that a convoy could punch through a kill zone with improvisation and courage, perhaps other drivers, in other deserts, on other roads would not have to die in lines like cattle. That thought gave weight to every tiny decision. The angle of his steering wheel, the distance he held behind the armored car, the exact moment he decided to accelerate or back off to keep the spearhead tight. This, he realized, shaking with adrenaline, was what real influence felt like. Not medals or rank, but the knowledge that someone else's survival might hinge on whether he flinched or held the line. The ridgeline loomed closer now, dark shapes rising through the thinning smoke as they approached the heart of the ambush. Here, the Germans had dug in deeper, set their guns more carefully, confident that any British convoy reaching this choke point would be a gift. Muzzle flashes,